Now I'm excited to introduce you to Pamela. Pamela Williams is a member of the Germantown Monthly Meeting, PYM, and an educator who has worked in Friends, public and independent schools, and higher education with a focus on humanities, voices of race and gender, and application of contemplative pedagogy. She's a meditation instructor, dancer, and visual artist. She has presented at national conferences, most recently Quakers Colonizing and Decolonizing at Haverford College in June 2023. Again, welcome. We're really glad you've joined us tonight. Pamela, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here and hope that our time tonight not only connects with the material that I'm presenting somewhat from my own direct experience, but also opens a way for you to connect to experiences of your own and how you may reflect on other interactions with people from sacred lands across lands. So what I'm going to tell you a little bit about this, just so you know. What we'll be doing is Lahari will be showing a series of slides. They are fairly informational, except at the beginning when we're going to have an opportunity to settle in and what I say here in. And that I will explain that. And then we will also have a bit of time to consider sacredness. How are we sacred? How do we carry our sacredness over lands? And also through the wisdom stories of family. And I would encourage you to consider how you might like to make these shifts. At some point, you may want to take notes, either on your own experience, not extensively, but a note or word or two, or not. Sometimes deep listening and presencing and opening directly offers a way of being present, and that is a choice. And this is one of the aspects that I encourage you to consider in our time as we settle in and hear in. So during this practice, you are invited to hear in and be present. You may find you wish to just listen, take notes if you choose. Reflection and questions will have a place at the conclusion of the presentation. Support your own way to open spacious breath and awareness. One way I often encourage connectedness, although we are in our own spaces, we are sharing an experience. And I would offer to experience how your own 2 feet may be resting. Take an in-breath and let it flow through you. Sacredness. How are we sacred? How do we carry our sacredness over earth? Through the wisdom stories of family, note in your experience, or if you are journaling or doing some kind of directed way of giving a visual representation of any experience. We can move to the next slide. This is a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the ancestral lands upon which we sit, of the origins and continued presence of the Lenni Lenape. We also acknowledge the holders of lands spoken in this presentation, those of participants, and the intention to work toward right relationship into the future. This land acknowledgement is written from the land of Lenni Lenape, which for Philadelphia Yearly Meeting would be the original lands. Tonight, I am actually coming to you from Abenaki lands, but in the spirit of this presentation, this is an intention to consider the journey over time of ourselves and others and into the future. During the telling of the story that I will offer and the information, I am encouraging using a restorative mindset. And if you're new to this, it is simply to view practice and being present and intention as a way to experience and grow. There is no right, there is no wrong. It is simply the intention to be present, acknowledge thinking, and see this as a way of growing. And that means that the words that you may hear, they are perspective of information and truth as perhaps given through many sources, but in the sense of story, they evolve through us and can be experienced from the perspective of I think, I feel, I notice, I wonder. Now, what I'm probably going to do here is narrate us through so that we're not distracted by exactly going slide by slide. And then if people desire, we'll arrange to make slides available so that you really hear this. And the words on the slide are merely our guides. And I say this because this story comes from an interaction with my own family, who are Benjamin Banneker descendants. And the opportunity that was offered by Doug Swift, who is a professor and journalist at Denison University, who was doing documentary research. And he was involved in doing a project called 10,000 Acres. And one of the intentions in doing the documentary was seeking the story of the land now home to the Wilds, which is a wildlife conservation center. It is actually the largest wildlife conservation center in the continental US, located in Cumberland, Ohio. And the purpose of the endeavor was to tell the full stories of those involved. So he asked if Banneker descendants would be interested in participating. And what was offered is an opportunity to use historical material. And when we had a area reunion in Ohio, in the Zanesville, Ohio area, he did bring a team. And the reciprocity here, though, was that in doing his documentary work, they did quite a bit of exploration of the lands. And what is notable here is some of the history of the sacred lands involve mounds that are quite old, and even before the time when we're talking about this, about 800 BCE. And the interaction here that is something very interesting to consider is the nature of the earth. And as settlers came to these lands, many people, including farmers, plowed through the land unaware of the tomahawks, spearheads, other artifacts, and without an intention or awareness of the value. There was noted that there was a farmer that found skeletal remains. And this is a story, I think, though this information may sound somewhat disturbing, it tells why the sense of considering reclaiming lands and sacredness. Often we are reconciling very deeply. And there was an account written by an archaeologist who actually wondered about how a person could live in a brick house made in part from the bones of other humans. The question, as we often try to uncover information, also uncovers different values, sacredness, and what I would say is something that is don't know mind, which in a meditation sense is an opportunity to consider that it sometimes a don't know mind offers the opportunity to be the most open to questions. So in this consideration, the development of the wilds, which is now somewhat a commercially run conservatory, but also hosts other recognition, including the historical marker of the Lett Banneker family. And what I would tell you about this in direct experience is that when we had the gathering where Doug Swift came and filmed and journeyed with us across these lands, they had actually moved the marker even in the wilds. Now, there are other adjacent lands of the Lett settlement to which we also visited, and you can still see the remains of some of the houses and a schoolhouse that was built there. The reason I talk about this is these lands, the Lett settlement as it came, these were free African descendant people, multiracial, and the land area in that area is heavily Quaker settled, and certainly not directly on the Lett settlement, but nearby was the pathway of the Underground Railroad. The thing is that if we think about free land was the Indian lands taken for no money, then taken outright, taken for pennies on the dollar for their value. Historically, by 1840, with the Indian Removal Act, Native peoples were forced to the northwest corner of Ohio. And so now some of these lands we see as an example with the wilds, even though it's conserved land, who has walked over the sacredness? And this is an interesting journey to consider, which we as descendants discussed, because the parallel is that many of the Banneker descendants were free people, but there are some stories that the land that they lived on did not provide the same rights and access to some aspects, such as education. And it also at times split the community by race in terms of religion and practices. Now, why the issue of progress? Many of these settlements, and there were many in Ohio, like this, multiracial settlements. But as we know, the progression of tensions leading towards the Civil War, and also when there became a time that the value of some of the land became known for purposes like coal mining, which was actually seen as advancement, the rights of people and the sacredness of the land was not recognized. And the interaction here with a university being involved even now doing this work is not irrelevant, because in many situations, we have advancement even in the sense of educating and the taking of information in a way that is thought to put forward information to the future, but not necessarily equilaterally gives recognition to the loss of control of lives that preceded advancing this information forward. And how this happened, I mean, I've talked a little bit about the sense of removal with the Indian Removal Act during this period, but the story of removal in the Lett settlement has a bit of a different cast, because, again, these were free people who paid taxes. Ohio was originally a free state, but if you, Lahiri, want to move to the slide that has removal in the Lett settlement, we will take a look at what this meant and why the timing is also notable when we look at the 1820s to 1830s. There was an attempt to actually expel 3 colored children from their white schoolhouse, so determined that they went to the school, so determined, these were people who were like the school administrators, to physically remove the children. Well, you see, prior, there was no issue about people attending the school together. But you also had more free Black people moving to the area with means to purchase sizable tracts of land. And while respected by many, as racial tensions seeped into all aspects, it meant splits. And the situation led to a lawsuit, which was actually settled in favor of the Lett residents. But by that time, the determination was to provide a separate schoolhouse. And so one of the Lett property owners provided the land, and a schoolhouse was built. It was burned several times. It was rebuilt after each fire. And the last structure, built in 1864, remained standing until a coal company demolished it for strip mining in the 1950s. And at its peak, the quote unquote colored schoolhouse had an enrollment of 60 students. Well, what I would tell you is the story has another variable, which is that this is a mixed race community. And what happened when they came to quote unquote expel this quote unquote colored children, they could not distinguish because directly by the range of color. And there is a narrative story that tells the fact that one of the school administrators actually pointed out a child who was the child of one of the other administrators who were white, because they all, I mean, by visual appearance, they could not really tell. So these are the themes when we talk about what is sacred. And even in the process of removal, and if you want to say resettlement, for instance, even now, the universities who are doing some of the research in Ohio, they are now bound actually to do certain actions in relation to the sacred mound lands. And there are various processes that they are doing by recognition. And so the let settlement lands, the true let settlement lands, still exist. There's really nothing there. They were strip mined, and there was only one family who actually stayed long enough on the land to, like we say, into the 50s, get bought out. What this says is that people needed to leave, even though they were free people and had access to the lands and rights. They left. And when the Homesteading Act opened, like in the 1860s, the grouping of let settlement descendants, many of them moved to Michigan, and even to this day, there are parallel sets of families, and there are area reunions. There is a picture here of the Let family reunion in 1948. These area reunions have occurred since 1923 in some form. And the parallel grouping continue to have what are called the old settlers in Michigan. And what is very interesting there, many of the settlers there settled near an area that is near Mount Pleasant, Michigan, which is actually the site of one of the Indian boarding schools. So the coalescence of these histories offer a great deal to consider, even as we look at basically what you might want to say conflicts in consideration, but even in doing restorative practices. And either through conservation or educational organizations. And I also say this because many of these lands were adjacent to many Quaker settled lands who were certainly important, because that is also how there was access to being able to purchase land by free people. And we do know that in Athens County, Ohio, many of the Let family members did attend Friends meeting, and it is not so much the same history as they moved to Michigan. But these are very striking considerations, because in educational organizations who do research, and as someone like me who has done some clinical research in the past, and looked at cultural appropriation, even when doing circle or council practices that are actually used to bring communities together. The recognition, though, that we are actually culturally appropriating something, even though we are hopefully bringing more truth to a legacy, these are considerations, and the collaboration between scholars, descendants, and tribal members, continue to be an area to look at how this collaboration is respected, and yet how the loss and reclamation is balanced. I really have learned a great deal by being involved directly as a descendant, because even within speaking with people who have written, for instance, on Benjamin Banneker or know the history, most notably in relation to Quakers, was Andrew Ellicott, whose family were Bucks County Quakers who settled Ellicott City, Maryland. And one of the significant things they did was advocate for a change in the crops from tobacco, which is a slave-intensive crop and depletes the land. But their connection also was that they were surveyors. And they were surveyors for the laying out of Washington, D.C. And Andrew Ellicott secured a position for Benjamin Banneker to be part of the surveying team. So again, how we place our feet on land, and surveying is very interesting because in those days, it also relied on looking at the sky and the astronomy and the calculations. And this again shows our interdependence. Even as we are finding ways to place our feet, we are needing to open our senses and our observation to the totality. I just bring these forward because one of the other things that we are seeing in our culture today, even with education particularly, is catalog and archiving. There are many aspects to knowing names of lands and what this means to do the recataloging, and also legacy members and alumni. And this is something that we're seeing in, like I say, educational organizations, colleges, that has long-ranging effects. So I will close with this. And we'll have a bit of time now to consider what your experience has been in hearing this information from my story, but also hopefully to consider what this opportunity means for you in looking at the sense of sacredness in yourself. And as we say, how we have walked and will continue to walk cheerfully, considering the history of removal, resettlement, and our intention of conservation and conciliation. So thank you.